And thank you. Now, I have to correct you. I'm not looking into the bright future. I'm looking into the bright future, just this far. And that's what my speech is going to be about. I'm very happy to be here. Now, TED and TEDx has been sort of a legend for a couple of years. It has grown from being a small thing that only a selected elite talked about in almost closed rooms to become something of a movement which everyone talks about and everyone knows about, and it has reached almost mythical proportions, which is interesting because I'm going to talk about myths. So I'm going to give you a lecture on myths. Myths are the fabric of human culture. Myths are the actual textile, the weave of which we build the social structures. Myths are, whether they are the large, almost fraudulent myths like religion telling us who is bad and who is good, or it's small but not less fraudulent myths telling us not to go swimming after we've eaten. They are actually a fundamental tool of humanity. We use myths to tell other people, more often than ourselves, what to do and what to don't, and so on. Myths have to have three qualities to be myths for real. There are three golden rules, and the first one is they have to be old. Now this places myths in a very separate chamber from all other things, because if you look at this scientific breakthrough or a loaf of bread, you would say it's better if it's new. Myths don't work that way. There are no such thing as a new myth. Myths have to be old, very, very old, to be powerful. The second rule is they have to be rural. That's sort of strange, but there are no city myths. Myths have to have their origin in a rural population, people who work with their arms and legs and bodies, and people who sort of create the myths out of the sweat of their labor and so on. And the third rule is myths have to be incomprehensible. That's why it's called mythical, right? So if I tell you it's a rule that you cannot park your car on this side of the street tonight, that would never become a myth, because you would understand it. So myths have to be incomprehensible. They have to be sort of vague and strange and extraordinary in some way. So given those three rules, it's obvious that the best myths are the old Indian ones. Now they're old, it says so. They are rural. Indian lived in the countryside, and they are incomprehensible due to two things. The first one is that none of us really speak Indianese, and the second one is that they are full of strange things, eagles that talk and other things that we don't really believe exist, so we have the feeling that this has to be some sort of figurative speaking. The old Indian myth. So I'm going to talk to you about the old Indian myth, but not in general, but in particular, and it's one of them I'm going to give you a speech on, and that is the saying, think 7 generations ahead. This, of course, is an address to sustainability and to environmental issues and whatever. You cannot talk to an environmental expert or someone talking about fairness or whatever without, within 5 minutes, hearing him or her say, you have to understand the old Indian saying, think 7 generations ahead. Now, apart from this statement being absurd, which it is, of course, because if my ancestors were to think 7 generations ahead to give me a good life, they would sit in the end of the 18th century trying to realize what Malmö 2010 would look like, which is absurd. But it's worse than that. So let me give you a lecture on why it's very, very, very dangerous to try to think 7 generations ahead or even 1 generation ahead. Now this myth, this particular saying, could be described as the final sign of that we have to get rid of the Indian myth. Because the Indian myth, the actual belief that you can see into the future is built out of a few building stones, and I'm going to show them to you. The first one is the action. The Indian myth is built on some sort of presumption that I want to do something, that's the action, and I have to foresee its consequences. So the action takes place on a time scale which has a history, that is the time before the action, and it has a future, that is the time after the action. And the Indians apparently said that the axis should be 7 generations long. To consider the effects, I have to put another axle on, and that is this one, I hope, yeah. Pros and cons, cost and benefits. What I'm supposed to do is to weigh the costs against the benefits, to weigh the pros against the cons. And most of us have a perception of this that looks something like this. There is a cost. Now the action could be take an exam, buy a car, raise a kid, build a house. Well, there's a cost to do this. The studying before the exam is the cost of the exam. The savings before you can buy the car is the cost before the car. And then you believe that the car will sort of give you a payback. And you're made to believe that the payback, of course, will be bigger than the cost. That's the main thought. If that's not true, I suppose you wouldn't do the action, whatever it is. This picture relies on 3 assumptions. The first one is that you have good knowledge. Of course, you have to have some sort of grounds for your decision making, and that is good knowledge. The second assumption is that you make the right action. Because decision is not about buying a car, but buying the right car. The decision is not about taking an exam, it's about taking the right exam at the right university. It's not about buying a house, it's about buying the right house on the right site. And finally, given that you have good knowledge and given that you are taking the right action, you hope for long payback. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician to realize that if this curve is true, well then the longer the payback, the better the benefits, the better the wages, whatever. There's one more thing to say about this picture, and that is that the action is sort of a stop of a lot of processes. Once I buy the car, the learning has stopped. Any knowledge that comes into my mind or the engineer's mind or whatever the day after I bought the car will not be put into it. Any book printed the day after I take my exam, after my graduation, will not be put into my exam. Any new technology invented after I open the house and get in for the first time will obviously not be built into the house. So the actual action constitutes a point on this timeline where learning stops. So what we have to hope for is that the cost-benefit analysis and the best knowledge is stable enough to carry us into the payback time. So let's see what happens. I'm going to show you the lifetime of... This, of course, is not what's supposed to happen. Try that again. Anyway, this is not what the picture should look like, but we'll try that anyway. I'm going to tell you a little about the lifetime of actions and the lifetime of knowledge. What's the lifetime of an action? Well, that is the longevity of the consequences of that action. We talk about half-lives. That is, if I produce 1,000 cars in the year 2010, I could ask myself, how long does it take until half of those cars are gone? How long would it take till all of the cars are gone? But how long would it take till half of the cars are gone? If I take an exam, I could ask myself, how long does it take until the exam is just worth half as much as when I left the school? The thing is, the Indian, the one who started this discussion, his actions had a very short life. The consequences of any Indian 300 years ago, of any Indian action 300 years ago, had a very short life. They were nomads. They lived in tents. If they picked up the tents and packed up the gears and went away, 2 years later you couldn't tell that they've been there. The knowledge, though, had a very long lifespan. Knowledge was very, very stable in the Indian society. What does this mean? It means that the knowledge any Indian had would be, for the major part, the same knowledge that his father had. And it would be, for the main part, the same knowledge as his kids had. So knowledge was stable and actions were short. So the Indians were right. It would be very economical sense, a very good sense at all, to prolong your actions, to prolong your view, to prolong the consequences of what you do. even until the absurd point of 7 generations. So they did. Of course they did. We all did. This is not about Indians, it's about human history. And the story of human history is the story about prolongation. We went from tents to houses. We went from trodden paths in the forest till permanent roads. We prolongated everything because that was wise. Meantime, the lifespan of knowledge shortened. We didn't mean that to happen. It just happened. It happened with increasing school system. It happened with increasing printing abilities. It happened with increasing volumes of knowledge altogether. So the lifespan, the half-time of knowledge actually shortened. Something like this. Now the Indians are still right. It would still be wise to prolong the effect of all activities because there's a lot of room left. So we did. Next step is interesting because the knowledge still shortened. So now we're pretty close. This is an interesting place. This is 1930, 1940. This is when an education became about as long-living as a human being. This is when the knowledge built into a car was true and valid for about as long as the car was still on the street. This is a very interesting period in time. The Indians are still right. As you can see, I've drawn this picture very carefully, so the knowledge still has a little room for the actions. But twist the knob just a little bit. Just twist it just a little bit and consider a world where the lifespan of knowledge is just a little bit shorter than the lifespan of the actions built on this knowledge. And you'll be in trouble. You will have cars still on the street for the last year of their lives, which no longer is state of the art, which not only is good working, but they're actually dangerous. You will have educated people at offices at the very end of their employment doing wrong things. Still, we can live with this because the positive side, the payback, the benefits are still a lot bigger than the costs. But continue the journey. Keep on prolonging the activities and shortening the lifespan of knowledge, and you will get to a point that looks like this. And this, of course, is not a funny place to live. This is a place where the Indian saying is not only wrong, but it's catastrophical. This is a place where we build ourselves a world built on the best knowledge in the year 2010, and it's going to be a disaster already 2014, 2016, 2018. And we have, as those Indian idiots we are, built a lot of things that will last for 50, 60, or 70 years. If I take this curve and put it on the first graph, it will look something like this. We still have a cost-benefit axis. We have investment before the action. We have payback time. But pretty soon, almost always, sooner rather than later, we'll be back in a place where what we did brought more costs than benefits. Now, of course, if this is true, then the longer payback time we have, the greater is the disaster. So I'm going to give you a conclusion. The first conclusion is that if smart people act on the best of their knowledge, we should all hope for long-lasting consequences. This is true. This applies to common sense and so on. But I'd like to add, as long as we are sure that they will appear smart for as long as their actions have consequences. Now, the first part of this sentence is, of course, flattering for any parent, any teacher, any politician. The second part is not. The second part tells us that if I were an Indian, which I'm not, if I were to establish myths, which I will not, I'm not old, I'm not rural, and I'm not incomprehensible, well, maybe the latter part, but anyway. I would change this old saying, and I would give you this advice as my last word. Your actions must never have consequences that reach further than you can see. And you can go home and you can ask yourself, can I see through this summer? Can I see through next spring? Can I honestly tell myself and my surroundings that I can see into the year 2015, 2020, or 2030? Because that's what you have to do if you advise a kid on how to make it through school, or if you plan to buy a car with a 15-year lifespan, or invest in a building with a 33-year-old long loan or something. If not, it's time not to prolong it, your perspective, but shorten it. Thank you.